I was 61 years old when I finally understood that love can be just as dangerous as loneliness. 5 years earlier, if someone had told me that remarrying would almost cost me everything I spent my entire adult life building, I would have smiled politely and changed the subject. I was not a foolish woman. I was not naive. I was not desperate, or at least that is what I told myself. My name is Evelyn Carter, and this is my true story from Memphis. I did not inherit anything. No land, no business, no safety net. When I was 32, I was a newly divorced single mother with a 10-year-old son, a used pickup truck, and a small rented office near the Mississippi River. I worked in food distribution back then, coordinating deliveries between local farms and grocery suppliers. It was an industry run almost entirely by men who believed women belonged in accounting or customer service, not logistics and operations. They underestimated me. That mistake paid for my future. I started small. One refrigerated truck, one storage lease, long nights negotiating fuel contracts, and early mornings unloading pallets myself when drivers called in sick. There were years I slept on a folding cot in my office during peak season. Years when I chose which bills to pay late so payroll would clear on time. Years when I signed personal guarantees that would have ruined me if a single deal collapsed. But the deals did not collapse. Slowly, they multiplied. By the time I turned 45, I owned my first cold storage facility. By 55, I had 3 warehouses and long-term contracts with regional producers across Tennessee and Arkansas. My company was not flashy, but it was essential. Food moved because my systems worked. People trusted me because I never failed to deliver. By 60, my business was stable. Debt was manageable, and my assets were substantial. I was not a billionaire. I was something better, secure, independent, proud, and alone. My son had grown, moved out of state, and built a life of his own. My days were full, but my evenings were quiet. Too quiet. I would sit on my back porch in Midtown Memphis, listening to the cicadas hum in the summer heat, wondering when my life had narrowed to spreadsheets and silence. I told myself I was content. I told myself companionship was optional. But loneliness does not ask permission. It seeps in slowly, disguising itself as reflection, as rest, as peace. That is when I met Thomas Hale. He appeared at exactly the right moment. Calm, attentive, respectful. A man who seemed impressed, not intimidated by what I had built. A man who listened without trying to fix me. A man who made the quiet feel less heavy. I did not know then that I was standing at the edge of the most dangerous chapter of my life, and that the only reason I survived it was because of one truth I chose not to share. I met Thomas Hale on a Thursday evening in early October at a community fundraiser in downtown Memphis. It was one of those events I usually avoided. Overpriced tickets, forced small talk, people networking under the disguise of charity. I had only gone because one of my longtime vendors was being honored for donating refrigerated storage to local food banks, and he insisted I attend. Thomas was standing near the back of the room, not holding a drink, not trying to be seen. He had that quiet confidence that comes from a lifetime of knowing how systems work. He introduced himself without urgency, without the rehearsed charm I had learned to distrust. "I'm Thomas," he said. "I used to help companies stay out of trouble." I laughed. That sounds exhausting. He smiled in a way that felt genuine. It was. That's why I retired. We spent most of the evening talking about ordinary things. The river, Memphis traffic, the way the city always felt like it was reinventing itself. He did not ask about my company until I mentioned it first. When I did, he listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, never once implying he knew better. That should have been my first warning. Men who understand power rarely reveal how well they understand it. Thomas was 66, widowed, and lived alone in a modest house east of the city. He spoke about his late wife with restraint, never using grief as currency. He told me he had spent his career as a compliance consultant, helping corporations navigate regulations and internal controls. It sounded dry, but his eyes lit up when he talked about problem solving. I recognized that look. It was the same one I got when a complex logistics plan finally clicked. Our first coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into weekends together. He never rushed me, never pressured me. When I canceled plans because a freezer unit failed or a shipment went missing, he didn't complain. He asked how he could help. I noticed the small things. He remembered my son's name. He brought books he thought I would like, not expensive gifts. He never commented on my home or my lifestyle in a way that felt evaluative. Compared to the men I had dated briefly over the years, Thomas felt safe, predictable, mature. When he told me about his children, it was with pride, but also distance. 2 daughters and a son, all grown, all living nearby. Successful, he said. Independent. Close as families go. I did not meet them right away, and at the time, I appreciated that boundary. 3 months in, he asked me why I had never remarried. I told him the truth. I had built something that required all of me. I did not have room for distraction. He nodded as if that answer made perfect sense. I understand, he said. I lost my wife, but before that, I lost myself trying to be everything for everyone. That line stayed with me. It felt honest. When he proposed the idea of marriage, it was quiet, no grand gesture, no audience, just the 2 of us sitting on my porch, the air heavy with summer heat. I don't need anything from you, he said. I just want to build something together, whatever that looks like. I believed him. Looking back now, I understand how carefully he chose his words, how nothing he said was technically untrue, and how much he left unsaid. Because while I was falling in love with the idea of companionship, Thomas was learning the shape of my life, and he was doing it very, very patiently. When Thomas and I began talking seriously about marriage, I did what I had trained myself to do in every major decision of my adult life. I slowed everything down. Love has a way of demanding speed. Business never does. The first call I made was not to my son or my friends. It was to my attorney, Grace Whitman, a woman who had guided me through acquisitions, lawsuits, and more than one near disaster. She had seen me at my most exhausted and my most decisive. If she hesitated, I paid attention. Evelyn, she said after listening quietly, I'm not saying don't get married. I am saying protect what you built. We drafted a prenuptial agreement that was clear and unambiguous. Everything I owned before the marriage would remain mine. The company, the properties, the land under every warehouse. No exceptions. Thomas reviewed it with his own counsel and signed without argument. He even joked about how romantic lawyers could be. That should have reassured me. Instead, it unsettled me. Because while the legal protection was in place, something deeper felt unfinished. A quiet tension I could not name. It was not fear. It was recognition. Over the next few weeks, Thomas asked gentle questions. How long the company had been around, whether it had always been under my name, how complicated the ownership structure was. Nothing overt. Nothing alarming, but the pattern was there. When his children came up in conversation, he mentioned they were curious about the business. Proud, he said. Interested. I smiled and nodded, keeping my answers general. I had spent decades learning how to speak in ways that revealed progress without revealing vulnerability. That was when I made the decision that would later save my life's work. I did not lie outright. I simply did not correct assumptions. When Thomas referred to the company as something I managed rather than owned, I let it stand. When he mentioned family assets in passing, I did not clarify. When the subject of property came up, I spoke about it as if it were layered, complicated, spread across trusts and long-standing agreements. I let him believe there were other hands on the wheel. Not because I planned anything, not because I suspected him of wrongdoing, but because something inside me refused to hand over the full map of what I had built. People often misunderstand this part when I tell them my story. They assume secrecy equals distrust, that if I loved him, I should have been transparent. What they fail to understand is that transparency without boundaries is exposure. And exposure is dangerous when you are the one holding value. I had been underestimated before. I had watched men smile while waiting for me to make a mistake. I had survived by knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. Marriage did not erase that instinct. If anything, it sharpened it. When we married quietly at a small chapel outside Memphis, I stood beside Thomas, feeling hopeful, grounded, and strangely alert. I did not feel guilty for what I had not shared. I felt prepared. Because the truth is this: if someone loves you for who you are, they do not need to know the exact price of what you own. And if they need that information to feel secure, then they are not in love with you, they are in negotiation. I did not know yet which category Thomas fell into, but I was about to find out. I met Thomas's children for the first time 3 weeks after the wedding. They came to my house on a Sunday afternoon, arriving separately but somehow together, like they had coordinated the timing. All of them were polite, smiling, perfectly appropriate. And yet, from the moment they stepped inside, the air shifted. His eldest daughter, Lauren, was the first to start asking questions. She worked in commercial real estate, she told me, which she said as if it explained everything that followed. She noticed ceiling heights. She commented on zoning. She asked how long the neighborhood had been trending upward. His son, Caleb, worked in financial consulting. He lingered near my office doorway, eyes scanning shelves and file cabinets with professional curiosity. He asked about long-term contracts, risk exposure, how diversified my revenue streams were. The youngest, Marissa, said little at first. She smiled often, nodded, watched. When she did speak, her questions landed softly but precisely. Who handled my legal filings? Whether I had ever thought about succession planning. If the company would remain in the family? I answered carefully, vaguely, always just enough. At first, I told myself they were simply protective, curious, a family trying to understand the woman their father had married. That explanation lasted exactly 1 visit. The questions did not stop. They evolved. Lauren asked whether I had recently updated insurance valuations on the warehouses. Caleb wanted to know if I had ever considered restructuring ownership for tax efficiency. Marissa asked if I had a will. Not gently. Not privately. Right there at the dinner table? Thomas never stopped them. That was what disturbed me most. He would sit back, hands folded, listening as if these were reasonable dinner topics. When I deflected, he smiled and said things like, "They're just trying to look out for us," or "Family planning is important at our age." Our age. It was subtle, but the language shifted. Us, ours, family assets, shared future. A few weeks later, Thomas slid a folder across the kitchen counter one morning while I was reviewing shipping reports. "Just routine paperwork," he said casually. "Beneficiary updates. Some authorization forms in case of emergencies." I read every page. 2 of the documents had nothing to do with emergencies. They granted financial authority, broad authority, the kind that allows someone to act on your behalf without supervision. I closed the folder and slid it back. "I'm not signing these," I said. He laughed, but it was thin. "You don't trust me?" "I trust myself," I replied. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. He did not yell. He did not threaten. He withdrew. Days passed where he barely spoke to me. When he did, his tone was distant, clipped, unfamiliar. Then the phone calls began. He would step outside to take them. Long conversations held just out of earshot. When I asked who had called, he would shrug. Work stuff, or one of the kids. I began noticing small changes. A filing drawer slightly ajar, documents moved, questions from my staff that did not originate with me. Nothing I could point to. Nothing concrete. Just a growing sense that my life was being examined without my consent. By the end of that year, I understood something I had not wanted to admit. This was no longer about marriage. It was about access. And every instinct I had spent decades trusting was telling me that someone was counting what I owned and deciding how to take it. The first real shock did not come as a confrontation. It came as a whisper. One of my longest-serving operations managers called me late one evening. His voice was hesitant, careful in the way people sound when they are not sure if they should be speaking at all. "Evelyn," he said, "I didn't want to alarm you, but someone contacted our legal compliance desk this afternoon." My stomach tightened. About what? They were asking about ownership documentation, filings with the county, whether any changes were expected this quarter. That alone was strange. No changes had been planned. No restructuring discussed. No one outside my legal team should have been asking those questions. "Did they identify themselves?" I asked. He hesitated. "They said they were calling on behalf of your family." That night, I did not sleep. The next morning, I called Grace and asked her to run a routine audit. Quietly. No notifications, no alerts, just a check of public filings related to my properties and business entities. She called me back 3 days later. "Evelyn," she said slowly, "someone has been submitting documents to the county recorder's office." I felt the room tilt. What kind of documents? Proposed amendments, transfer drafts, partnership notices. My hands went cold. Did I sign any of them? "No," she said, "but your name is on them." I drove to her office and sat across from her desk as she laid the papers out one by one. They looked official, stamped, logged, filed. And yet, the signatures were wrong. Close enough to fool a clerk, not close enough to fool someone who had signed her own name thousands of times. "These are forgeries," Grace said. "Crude ones, honestly, but dangerous all the same." I stared at the documents until the words blurred. Someone had taken my identity and attempted to redraw the borders of my life without asking permission. "How far did this go?" I asked. "They didn't complete a full transfer," she said, "but they were laying groundwork, establishing a paper trail, creating the appearance of shared ownership." Shared with whom? I already knew the answer. Grace leaned forward. "Evelyn, you need to understand something. People don't do this unless they believe they have leverage or time." Time. That word echoed in my head long after I left her office. That afternoon, I began noticing everything I had previously dismissed. The questions, the paperwork, the silence after refusal, the sudden interest in legal structure. I realized I had been watching a slow-moving operation unfold, and I had mistaken patience for respect. That night, Thomas came home late. He said nothing about where he had been. I said nothing about what I knew. Instead, I began doing something I had not done in years. I documented everything. Emails, text messages, call logs, dates, times, who was present, who asked what. I took photos of filing cabinets before and after I left the house. I installed additional security on my office systems under the guise of routine upgrades. I did not confront him, because confrontation warns people, and I needed them to believe I was still unaware. Fear is paralyzing when you feel powerless. But when you know you still control the most important information, fear sharpens into focus. They thought they were ahead of me. They were wrong. And I was about to find out just how far they were willing to go. Once I understood that this was not a misunderstanding but a pattern, I knew I could not rely on intuition alone. I needed facts, cold, documented facts. I hired a private investigator named Marcus Reed. He came highly recommended, a former federal investigator who specialized in financial misconduct and elder exploitation. When I told him I wanted everything on Thomas Hale and his children, he did not ask why. He simply nodded and said, "Give me 2 weeks." Those 2 weeks were some of the longest of my life. At home, I played my role carefully. I was agreeable, tired, distracted by work. When Thomas mentioned estate planning again, I said I would think about it. When his children asked questions, I smiled and changed the subject. I let them believe their patience was paying off. Inside, I was counting days. Marcus called me on a Wednesday morning and asked me to meet him in a quiet coffee shop near the river. He arrived with a thick folder and a look I recognized immediately, the look of someone who had seen this before. "Evelyn," he said, lowering his voice, "this is not their first time." Thomas had been married twice before his marriage to me. Both marriages ended in death. His first wife, Linda Hale, died after a prolonged illness. 6 months before her death, she transferred ownership of 2 commercial properties and her retirement accounts entirely into Thomas's name. Medical records showed cognitive decline. Her sister had attempted to contest the transfers, claiming undue influence. The case settled quietly. Thomas kept everything. His second wife, Rebecca Moore, died after a fall at a vacation property in North Carolina. 3 months before her death, she had executed a series of legal documents consolidating assets under Thomas's control. Her adult son filed a civil complaint. It was dismissed after Thomas produced signed authorizations and powers of attorney. Both cases ended the same way. Paperwork won, grief lost. Marcus flipped to another section. Thomas's children were not bystanders. They had been involved in asset management discussions during both marriages. Emails, texts, advisory roles, quiet coordination. Caleb had previously been named in a civil suit involving financial misrepresentation. Lauren had lost a professional license for ethical violations that never made headlines. Marissa had been terminated from 2 firms under non-disclosure agreements. "This is a family operation," Marcus said plainly. "They target women with assets, wait until trust is established, then move fast when vulnerability appears." I felt something break inside me. Not heartbreak, clarity. They were waiting for age to work in their favor. For illness, for fatigue, for grief, for any moment I might loosen my grip. "And you," Marcus continued, "you're the anomaly." I looked up. "Because I'm not sick." "Because you're not isolated," he said. "And because you didn't reveal what you owned." That was the twist they did not anticipate. I walked out of that meeting knowing 2 things with certainty. First, I was not imagining the danger. Second, if I did nothing, I would become the 3rd woman in a pattern that ended the same way every time. But I had something Linda and Rebecca did not: time, awareness, and proof. And now, I was ready to use it. Once you know you are being hunted, you have 2 choices: run or stop being prey. I chose the second. I did not change my routine. I did not confront Thomas. I did not pull away. I did the opposite. I softened. I agreed more. I nodded when his children spoke about the future. I let small suggestions land without resistance. I watched relief spread across their faces as they mistook compliance for surrender. I told Thomas I had been thinking about family, about legacy, about how exhausting it was to carry everything alone. That was when he smiled again, the old smile, the one I had not seen in months. "I'm glad," he said. "You shouldn't have to do this by yourself anymore." Behind that sentence was an assumption that soon I would not be. Over the next 6 weeks, I worked quietly with Grace and Marcus. Every conversation was recorded where legally permitted, every email preserved. We allowed the forged filings to remain untouched, exactly as they were, so intent could not be denied. We tracked who accessed what and when. Then I set the stage. I told Thomas I wanted to host a small family gathering. Nothing formal, just dinner. I said I wanted his children there. I said I was ready to talk openly about the future. He did not question it. He did not slow down. Greed makes people impatient. The night of the dinner, the house was warm with light. Food catered. Wine poured. Laughter rehearsed. Thomas's children arrived dressed like they were attending a negotiation, not a meal. They were confident. What they did not know was that they were not the only guests. Grace arrived first, blending in easily. Then Marcus. Then 2 individuals Thomas did not recognize but should have. The sister of his first wife. The son of his second. I watched Thomas's face change when he saw them. The color drained slowly, as if his body understood before his mind did. "What is this?" he asked quietly. I stood at the head of the table, my hands steady, my voice calm. "This," I said, "is a family conversation." Caleb stood up. "This is inappropriate." "So were the forged documents," I replied. The room went silent. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse emotionally. I laid out facts, dates, filings, emails, patterns. I handed Grace the floor, and she did what she does best. She dismantled lies with paper. When the investigator spoke, no one interrupted him. When the previous victims spoke, no one looked them in the eye. Thomas tried to speak once. Just once. "You misunderstand," he said. "I was protecting my family." I met his gaze. "You were stealing from women you thought would not fight back." The knock on the door came exactly on time. Law enforcement did not rush. They did not shout. They entered with quiet authority, already informed, already prepared. Handcuffs sound louder in silence. As Thomas was led away, he turned back toward me, not with anger, with disbelief. He had not lost because I was stronger. He had lost because I was patient. And I had never stopped owning myself. The house felt impossibly quiet after they were gone. Not peaceful, not relieved, just hollow, like a storm had passed and taken something with it. I stood alone in the kitchen, staring at a half-poured glass of wine, realizing that the life I thought I had rebuilt was never real to begin with. It had been a performance, and now the curtain was down. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Once authorities began pulling records, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The forged filings, the coordinated emails, the timing. What looked like isolated paperwork errors became a deliberate strategy when viewed together. Thomas and his children had not made a mistake. They had followed a plan. Within weeks, formal charges were filed. Fraud, forgery, conspiracy, elder exploitation. Thomas tried to fight it. He always had. But this time, paper was not on his side. The same tools he once used to silence grieving families now worked against him. His children turned on each other the moment immunity was mentioned. Cooperation replaced loyalty. Watching it unfold was not satisfying. It was sobering. I testified once, calmly, clearly. I did not embellish. I did not need to. The truth stood on its own. When the verdict came back, I did not cry. I felt something heavier lift. Not anger. Not fear. Confusion. How close I had come to losing everything without ever realizing it. The divorce was finalized quietly. The prenuptial agreement held exactly as written. Thomas left with what he came in with. Nothing more. Legal fees consumed what little remained of his resources. The house emptied quickly. His presence vanished like it had never belonged there. I stayed. The company continued. Contracts renewed. Warehouses ran. Employees showed up every morning, unaware of how close their livelihoods had come to being collateral damage in someone else's scheme. A year later, I replaced the locks and repainted the walls. Not because I needed to forget, but because I wanted to reclaim the space. I invited my son to visit more often. I learned how to sit with silence again, this time without mistaking it for emptiness. I never remarried. Not because love failed me, but because I no longer confuse companionship with safety. I am open. I am kind. I am no longer accessible to anyone who sees my life as a ledger. People sometimes ask if I regret not being more honest at the beginning, if I feel guilty for keeping that one truth to myself. I do not. Because that silence was not deception. It was protection. It gave me time to observe, time to notice the questions that came too early, time to let people reveal themselves when they thought they were winning. If I had announced my worth at the start, the pressure would have come sooner, harder, louder. I might not have survived it. Instead, I watched, I learned, I prepared. And when the moment came, I did not panic. I acted. Today, when people ask about my life, I answer honestly.